Greetings all. My name is Jacob Penny Johnson, and I work as a consultant and trainer for the Early Childhood Investment Corporation and the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership. I'm also a father of two, and I will be moderating today. We want to thank you all for joining today's webinar featuring a dynamic panel that I'll introduce here in a moment. And a special shout out to the Pritzker Children's Initiative for hosting today. Please use the chat throughout this webinar and feel free to let us know where you are tuning in from. We will do our best to answer questions and we'll follow up with a Q&A fact sheet for all attendees after. We also encourage you to share resources and experiences as panels move along the conversation. During this webinar, you will hear from 3 parent leaders about how to move beyond buzzwords and focus instead on time, trust, and power sharing. Representing communities from Michigan, New Mexico, North Carolina, and federally recognized sovereign tribes. These 3 parent leaders recently gave their time and talents to help the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families plan the first federally sponsored national convening solely devoted to creating an inclusive human service delivery system. We will also hear from Angela Green, Midwest Administrator for the Administration for Children and Families, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She will share about the benefits and outcomes of extending the tent to include everyone, and how working alongside family and parent leaders can strengthen diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility as a standard practice in our early childhood systems work. And so we'll get right into it with panelist introductions, and we'll start with Mr. Anthony Queen. And so Anthony is a parent representative who is dedicated to promoting the health of African American and Latinx families from pregnancy through early childhood, and to eliminating racial disparities in birth outcomes. Anthony is active with several national organizations, in addition to his work focused on fathers in Michigan. Anthony has also coined the trade and trademarked the phrase, collaboration moves at the speed of trust. Welcome, Anthony. Zachariah, thank you. Glad to have you here. And so Zachariah Ben, who is joining us by phone today, who's doing a little work on his farm, is a 6th-generation traditional farmer and sand painter in Shiprock, New Mexico. Zach has over 10 years of experience in traditional farming and is the founder and owner of BD Baby Foods, LLC, a Navajo-registered business that sells a product line of organic indigenous baby foods. Zach has been a member of the state-led Family Leadership Council, where he worked with other families to address early childhood issues through action and advocacy. Glad to have you here, Zach.
Morning, everybody.
And Amber Robinson is a parent of 2 rambunctious boys that keep her on her toes. She likes to call herself a community resource officer because she enjoys uncovering available resources so she can connect community members to the services, programs, and people they need. Ms. Robinson is a community advocate and a member of a few national committees and initiatives. So thankful to have you here, Amber. All right, and Angela Green. Angela Green serves as a regional administrator for the Administration for Children and Families, Region 5. Prior to becoming a regional administrator, she served as one of 10 regional program managers for the Federal Child Welfare Agency, ACF's Children's Bureau. In this role, she provided leadership and direction in the managing and approval, monitoring, and technical guidance for over $1.4 billion in child welfare funding to states and tribes for their foster care, adoption, child protection, and child welfare services. Welcome, Angela. So we want to get you all's voice in the room and thank you all again for being here. So we'll start with kind of just an opening icebreaker question. And so we all agree parents should be at the table during discussions about parents and families. Could you all briefly tell our audience what brings you to this work and what's your why? And if we could start with Amber on this.
Okay, great question. I appreciate it. I feel like I am a natural observer first, and that I keep the big picture in mind. I reflect on the summation of things, and I believe the little things and steps add up to the bigger picture as an approach and process, how people are brought in and at what points. With that said, as a personal practice, I not only see a need for effective processes, but I have a passion for process improvement and quality control. So when I am a part of something, I seek to be a team player, follow when necessary, step up and lead when necessary, and I speak up for right processes from a time I believe is necessary, which is usually in the beginning. I got involved in early childhood work because my son at an early age received supports, and I noticed that I had to advocate for him all along the way. So I went from PTA mom to parent trainings to eventually supporting organizations as a parent leader. And so that's what brought me to this work to not only improve systems for my child, but for all children and families, because I think we all deserve systems that work and support us.
Great. Thank you, Amber. So glad to have you here. And so we'll move on to Zach next. If you could tell us a little bit about your why and what brings you to this work.
Hi, I am very excited to understand the systems and what their approaches are and how they will serve our communities. Coming from a rural community, coming from a tribal community where a lot of our services are through the Indian Health Service, a lot of the quality of care is poor. And I feel like, when we were understanding that and growing up of environment, I felt like in order for my child to thrive, I would have to I would have to step up to the plate and talk about these experiences and address them and bring some solutions to the table as a parent and advocate. And so when we're expecting our son and when we were expecting our son, hearing that first news 2 years ago that we were pregnant was one of the most, I guess, monumentous times in my life, but understanding like there's some big change ahead, big change in myself, spiritually, biologically, and physically. And so those things I wanted to also bring to the table systemically of how we can create those changes together in that sense. And so with that, we had a traditional at-home birth in a Hogan, middle of nowhere, no running water and no electricity, had our midwives and doulas there present to give birth to our son. And so with that experience, to have that type of quality of care, but most importantly, that foundation and laying that for our child right there in the beginning. So that way, that foundation will take him to, for his life, and he'll be able to face any type of obstacles with those solutions and problem-solving ways, and with the support of the systems that surround him and the structures that surround him. And so that's, for me, what brings me to the table today, to ask those important questions and most importantly, bring solutions and how we can work together as a community and bring that quality of care services and most importantly, having those parents at the table. So I really am honored to be a part of this discussion today, and I appreciate you all, and really looking forward to our conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Zach. And so, Anthony, we'll move it along to you next.
Well, the reason I'm here is I see systems in a lot of organizations that talk about honoring parents, but they're not really doing it. And I just want to give I feel like if we're not transforming the system, all we're doing is transmitting it. And it's time for the change. We've been talking about the problem for so long. I think now we have solutions. And my tagline, collaboration does work at the speed of trust. For me, that was awakening, kind of that flashbulb moment, because the more I trusted an organization, the more I was willing to collaborate with it. And that's what I'm trying to get organizations to see. You can have all the bells and whistles, but if we don't trust you, what good is it? You're not going to get the turnout that you need, especially on the for the nonprofit world. You got to get that return on investment, or you're just going to be short all the time. So I'm just trying to show organizations, one, how to reach out to fathers, because fathers are different than mothers as far as this work is concerned. But you need fathers, because you can't say family if you're not including the father or the male role model. So I just try to get organizations to see that and acknowledge that, because a lot of times I went to offices and it was just like all pictures of women with their children. Sometimes I didn't see not one picture of a father. And I used to just ask organizations, if you flipped it and you came into the office to see nothing but men, and meeting their children, how would you feel? And I was surprised, like a lot of them had those same things up for like 3 or 4 years and they never even considered it. So I'm just trying to bring that voice for authentic engagement and share my experience. I've been blessed to be a part of like so many different organizations, and I've learned a lot. One time I was part of like 60 organizations at once. And I learned a lot, and I want to take that experience and show them like how to reach out to minorities, especially minority fathers, because they get so banged up by the media. And sometimes, you know, they feel like they can't contribute. And that's a shame, but we need to change that. So that's why I'm here.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. We are glad to have you here, and especially glad to have you lifting up the fatherhood voice within this conversation. And so, Ms. Angela Green, we would also love to hear from you in thinking about your why. Why are you engaged in this work, and what is your why?
Actually, when you mentioned the question, I kind of chuckled because that's something I constantly bring up to my team and those I work with, is to remind them of why we're at the table, why we're doing this work. And for me, I was raised in the Midwest by 2 Southern parents. And so we brought in everyone, and we were that community for many, and they were teachers. So I learned really how to value childhood from them. And I'm in this work, honestly, for children, to ensure that they have the ability to be a child, that they are safe and loved and protected. And to me, in order for them to live in that kind of environment, we have to support the parents who are raising them, despite the zip code they live in, despite how much melanin is in their skin, despite who they love or who they worship, or if they don't worship, despite all the barriers of whether they have certain abilities or not. But everyone, to me, deserves the tools and the skills and the support they need to be the best parent they could be, so that children could be the best that they could be, right? So that they could soar and spread their wings in a place that they're, safe and loved and protected. So for me, that is what keeps me in this work, is because I think childhood is sacred. And so I do everything I can to my talents, my skill, my gifts, my voice, to really help those that are really supporting and lifting up and raising our children.
Thank you, Ms. Green, and thank you all. Powerful, powerful so far. And so we want to go a little bit further. And all 4 of you, obviously, are leaders in early childhood systems arena. And so thinking about our topic today, time, trust, and power sharing, what recommendations do you have for government early childhood systems, local communities, and organizations who want to authentically engage family and parent leaders? And Zach, if we could start with you on this question.
Yeah, I think a lot of things, of course, but from my perspective and experiences, I think being able to address that access to care and those resources. And I think for me, oh my gosh, over time, understanding and growing up in an adverse, impoverished community, and inheriting those traumas, and how we can heal each other now using that trust and rebuilding that trust within each other as a community, and being able to rebuild that trust with the government. Coming from historical trauma, I feel like, being able to not trust the government in the first place, and moving forward with that, and understanding how, we want to have our children inherit. What do we want them to inherit? Do we want them to inherit the same trauma that we went through, or are we going to start building intergenerational wealth? And I talked in regards to that because with Bitty Baby Foods, we started this LLC where we are one of the first traditional baby food makers using traditional farming methods here, using our own natural resources on the Navajo reservation. And so throughout all that adversity, we identified a number of challenges. And one of those is like when we look at the social determinants of health, and how that impacts our children. ACEs, for myself example, I'm going to be vulnerable here and share this information because that helps us to give a perspective, but most importantly how we can work again together. But I'm going to share that I checked off every checklist there is on ACEs, and I'm sure a lot of majority of our communities do so as well. And so what can we do to heal each other when we're so adverse in that sense? And so with that, we felt like a really good start was feeding our children their first traditional foods by building a traditional cradle board using the Navajo philosophy to guide us in these life ways and creating that healing. And, that's something that we once practiced and up until 500 years ago. Now, learning a whole new culture, being assimilated to Americana, now having to live in that way and moving forward into now we get to merge both traditional knowledge of the Navajo and traditional knowledge and culture of the Americana and moving those together so that way we can again restart to begin to start building that generational wealth. And that's what we want our children to inherit, and that's how we will heal together. And so that's what I feel that I think that's what we need to bring to the table as in terms of like an organization, as parent leaders being able to bring those experiences and stories to the table, and that will bring that authenticity solutions to the table overall, so we can have our children live in a world where they're no longer having to survive but thrive.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Zach. And so, Anthony, we'll move on to you. What suggestions may you have around how organizations and initiatives can authentically engage family and parent leaders?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is while the strategy is being formulated, make sure parents are there. Because many times they'll get everything done, then they want parents to go out in the community and sell it. And they weren't part of the decision making. So why should they feel like they go out there and sell it? Secondly, I would say a line item in the budget, make sure it's included, make sure parents can see that. Because a lot of times, the first thing they talk about cutting is the parent part of their budget. But you're an organization that's supposed to help families. So how does that work? Next, I would say fathers, make sure fathers are included in the strategy of the organization. And again, a lot of times, fathers aren't even thought about. Fathers are like the and one. And you can't work with a family and make a community or a family, better without input from the father. It's just not going to happen. Another thing I would say is a lot of times when 24-hour news cycle, if they see something, like something bad happened with the African-American male, all of a sudden, everybody is Black Lives Matter. We're going to put up placards. We're going to let everyone know and see us. But I like to talk about when there's nothing in a 24-hour news cycle, when it's just like a regular day. The Black lives still matter. When a white state worker came to a Black community or a Black family, somehow they always lost. So even though your programs might have all this and all that, the family who was going, a lot of homes are multi-generational. So there's, you got Grandma Betty and Uncle Min telling them, don't get involved with them people, because somehow you're going to lose. And so I think that needs to be acknowledged, and you need to use that historical lens when trying to recruit parents and speak to community.
So glad to be having this conversation with you all. And so we want to move the conversation along a little bit. And we know that even within the early childhood system, that we can hear a lot of buzzwords, right? And so oftentimes we hear words like equity or lived experience or radical inclusion. And so these are just a few concepts or words that I often hear, and I think we often hear in parent leadership spaces. And so I'm wondering if you all can share suggestions on how organizations and institutions can really move beyond buzzwords to authentically engage those they serve. And so if we could maybe start with Amber on that. What suggestions would you have around, some of these buzzwords that we hear and how we can push institutions and organizations to move beyond just the buzzwords?
That's a great question. And buzzwords I get them because it kind of creates a common language and something to strive towards. But if you don't have authenticity in your organization, you're not going to achieve what you set out to achieve. So one thing I think that helps move past buzzwords, is a mindset shift and a cultural shift within organizations, shifting from focusing on funding and impact reports to actually how do we truly have authentic impact.
Thank you there, Amber. You gave us a lot again. And one of the things that I really heard you say again was, and you may not have said it specifically, but was just the relationship piece, that we can sound good and we can have all the, processes, but really are we in relationships with families while we're doing the work? You gave us a lot there. Thank you. Thank you, Amber. And so we'll move along to Zach. Zach, thinking about buzzwords that you may have heard, what suggestions do you have for agencies and moving beyond these buzzwords?
Yeah, so I think for me, buzzwords are used a lot in like preventive measures, or more for like treating measures rather than preventive measures. And so those are things that I feel like there's a big disconnect when you're having to treat something rather than preventing it. And so, radical inclusion for one of them, I think that's something that, people are frustrated. Our generation is frustrated about, the divide that we have within our communities. And I feel like, that's where healing comes into play. That's where acknowledging that trauma comes into play. And as Anthony, quotes very well, of building that trust to then have that collaborative effort to move forward in a progressive, healthy manner rather than a radical manner. It's radical now because we're so frustrated and tired of what we've experienced. And so, what can we do to move forward together in that sense? And to also, another one that I really like is the social emotional development of our children, prenatal to 5. That I feel like is very crucial years for our children. And as a buzzword, how are we acknowledging those practices? And that's going to immediately connect to equity. Equity is, as a father myself, like father engagement, father inclusion. When you go to birth classes, and when you go to see be a part of the prenatal appointments, you're not necessarily included because all of the materials and education are surrounded by mother and child rather than the father. And so the father is stereotyped out of that circle. And I feel like, being able to include them in those materials and have that education that fathers are important, and then it starts at home. And so, right now my wife and I were pregnant. And so I say we are pregnant. And, those are things that we are already acknowledging with our son. Postpartum, job for my wife, and have that also taking care of our child now. And so, as we're going to have a simultaneously caring for a newborn and a 2-year-old. And so that's where I say, having that equity, having that balance to be able to have no divide. If the dishes need to be done, it needs to be done. And so growing up, my father always taught us, when we were driving around and, you see something wrong, and as a child, I'm like, they should do this, they should do that. Why don't they create this? And my dad said, no. Who's they? I said, oh, right. Who is that? And then he's like, it's you. You can be the they. And so with that, what you see that needs to be done, you do it. And so that's where roles, for example, gender roles that come into the household and what you do are immediately disseminated, because there is no way to, assess that, because you do what needs to be done. For farm work, for example, where we're growing up our child and having that foundation and having that social and emotional development, using the birth, a traditional birth as that foundation, using the farm as that foundation, for them to create that awareness, to create that self-sustainability, and being able to have that development emotionally and socially by interacting with the earth, interacting with the plants, the plant life that's happening, why we manage and steward those lands in the first place, and most importantly, ritualize those processes. And that's where I feel like, a lot of the land-based learning comes into play in this area of social emotional development and education and equity, because the plants teach us those things. The spiritual components we're not including in these processes of what it means to be equitable, what it means to be a radical person and advocate, to having that social and emotional development and awareness and how we can progress together healthily and again into a thriving future. So that's where I come from with those lived experiences related to those buzzwords.
Wow. Thank you, Zach. That was a lot. And there was so much that you just shared that I would love to be able to come back to if we have time. And this idea of trust. But thank you once again. Anthony, let's move to you. Thinking about buzzwords and your suggestions on how we can move beyond those.
One of my personal buzzwords is the end user. I think a lot of times when we go to these meetings and just meet wherever we might go, the end user is not even thought about. It's more like academia and getting acknowledgement from other programs and look what we're doing and how we're doing it. And then the end user is not really benefiting from the decisions that are being made. And I tell all these organizations, like, do you ever really think about the end user? I think sometimes they've been there so long that the end user is not even like part of the decision making. It's just like, let's make these plans, do this, and if some families benefit from it, fine. But if not, oh well. And I'm just like, that has to change. You have to think about the end user when you're doing this, or why are you doing it? Then my other buzzword is lived experience. And as I have expressed before, just because a parent gives you permission to use her name or her situation at that one particular juncture, that's not a blank check that you can just go on and keep using that lived experience, because she might not want some people to know. So I say every time an organization wants to talk about someone or introduce someone with lived experience, make sure you have that permission first.
Such good suggestions, Anthony. What came to mind when you were speaking is this term tokenization. And while sometimes institutions and organizations and government entities may have the best intentions, there can sometimes be this tokenizing aspect that comes on with how they engage with parents. And in that institution and organizations really need to be careful about how they approach and ask to engage and work alongside parents. Thank you. Angela, any thoughts from your end just around buzzwords that you're hearing and how we can kind of move beyond those when we authentically work alongside parents?
Let me tell you, see, that's why Amber, Anthony, and Zach had to be with me on the planning of the convening that we had. The richness of what I just heard, right? From Amber talking about, great data, love the data, but can I get some action? Can we get some results from that? And from Zach talking about that radical change and how that's needed and the frustration, why we really need to move on these things. And Anthony, who also warned me and admonished me and say, hey, Angela, when you're using us, don't keep using us without our permission. I got that. I really learned from them throughout that process. And one thing I've learned, and it was my epiphany moment, Anthony, what I have been doing, when you're leading, there's a certain style you have, there's a certain way you go about doing your business, and you're comfortable in that. But when you're trying to be inclusive, I learned what I knew is no longer good enough. What was natural for me was not good enough. I had to get uncomfortable with how I go about doing my business, how I get information, how I include people, what I do, because we've been getting people's input for decades. That is not a new thing. I remember as a child being sitting on the school board to represent children and falling asleep because I didn't know what the conversation was, what I was supposed to do, So this is not a new thing, but I would say this is the first time in my career when I hear from administration, top political officials saying, no, I want those end users, I want them involved. I want to hear from them and being open and allowed to really do that in a way that is, Amber, authentic, right? And genuine. And when I think about these buzzwords, for me, I think of allyship and co-conspirator. And I had to start thinking about which one I wanted to be, because in the federal government, it's easy. let me say in government period, because I work state government, federal government, nonprofit, advocacy work, all that, right? But in government, it's really easy to be an ally. That means I put some language to it, put some words out there. I got some rhetoric behind it. I got the cute catchphrase, but there's no action. You don't see it. And it's hard because sometimes these government systems are hard to move. It's like moving that Titanic, because there's so many tentacles of laws and procedures and regulations that make it hard. And sometimes you just want to sit back, it's too hard. Let me just talk about it and not do it. And so for me, I want to be a co-conspirator instead of an ally. That means I want to relinquish some of my power and my privilege, and I want to leverage the power and the privilege and experience of those who've lived it. Because I recognize, even though I may have someone lived experience in users, that's still their experience. I still bring to the table my experience. So I need a diverse group. And if you all remember, when we had our planning committee, our listening session for the National Convening on Building an Inclusive Economy, Inclusive Human Services System, I picked the wrong name. That's the longest name ever. And I chose that, forgive me. But when we did that national convening, we had a vast array of people there. And I had individuals with disabilities, individuals representing LGBTQ+. I wanted everybody represent rural communities. You know, I wanted religious minorities. I wanted parents from each of those sections. I wanted national experts. I wanted state leaders. I wanted community advocates. I wanted everybody's voice there. Because everybody's voice matters. If you don't have them at the table, I knew then I would be handicapped. If I didn't have them at the table, if they didn't correct me, if they didn't give me a new way of thinking, didn't show me a different way. And I have to admit, that was the most unique convening that the federal government ever put on. We've never been that diverse, because we had that many voices at the table. We had that many different perspectives at the table. It makes for a richer product. It makes for better systems. So to me, we can't exclude parents. We can't. It's ridiculous to exclude them. How do I create about to get on a start preaching here. Yeah. How do I create a program, TANF or WIC or food stamps, and I never used it?
This is true. And so, Angela, you're speaking exactly to the term and the phrase that is kind of our tagline with the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership, which is nothing about us without us. And so it is so, I don't know if the word refreshing is right, but to hear you, in your position, really talk just about that phrase, that we should not be talking about any services that we're providing if the end user is not in the space helping to co-create what that work looks like. And so just want to thank you for your work. And this has been an extremely rich conversation. And I kind of want to move it on and talk a little bit more specifically about this national convening. And so you kind of teed us up. Before you do that,
Jacob, can I just add one thing real quick?
Please, Anthony, go ahead.
When you formulating your organization, if you have 12 you sitting around the table, you're not going to be inclusive. Because if you're getting the same thing and everybody's agreeing on everything you're saying, and you go to the same church, you go to the same grocery store, how are you going to really reach out to families who might benefit from your organization if they don't even know about it? And that's one thing I tell them. Here in King County, there's a gazillion programs, but you go to certain pockets of neighborhoods, never heard of them. I mean, they've been in business for 20 years, and certain pockets never even heard of them. So if you keep doing the same thing, why would you expect to get different results?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that, Anthony. Thank you. And I heard Angela as she was speaking earlier in this idea of being comfortable, and that if we want different results, we got to be willing to get uncomfortable. And so I'm appreciating you bringing that back up. And so I want to transition. We got a few more questions as we're kind of winding this conversation down, and just want to thank you all again. This has been an extremely rich conversation. You all have shared a lot of great tools and insights with us. So thank you. And so I want to transition and speak a little bit more about this national convening. And it is so great for Angela to hear you say that there has never been a national convening of this kind. And so Amber, Zach, and Anthony, After your experiences planning, attending, and in some cases presenting at the national convening on building an inclusive human service system, what is one action that you hope the federal government will take going forward? And Amber, we can start with you.
Okay. Great question, Jacob. And before I do share that, just hearing Angela speak and her reflectiveness that she adds to her leadership makes me hopeful that we are on the right trajectory with this initiative and that it's in good hands. Even though the name is long, I feel like it really, lets people know what the mission is so that we can be held accountable and the government can be held accountable for staying on target, on task. And so I'll just say as we co-designed and kind of checked in with the disparities and the root causes, and we also contributed best practices and solutions, so that I'm hoping that we will be also engaged to kind of evaluate and implementation when it comes to that implementation process, that is not just about conferences and webinars, that we're actually going to contribute to informing policies and actually changing the way that business is done, so that business is not done as usual moving forward, that we're actually informing how to restructure, what things are needed in these areas that are these communities that are underserved. You've given us a taste of having a voice at such a high table. So I hope that we structures are in place to continue to bring those voices. As Angela has said, that it is important that end user, and Anthony about end users, but everyone needs to be at the table collaboratively creating this, because if mindsets are not changed, if we're not interacting and showing our experiences to those that are creating or making the decisions, then that there will continue to be breakdowns in the process. And so I'm very hopeful from what Angela shared, her being in that position, that it will translate in that way.
Great. Thank you, Amber. Thank you. And so we'll transition to Zach. Zach, after your experiences, planning, attending the national convening, what is one action item or suggestion that you hope the federal government will take going forward?
Yes, I think a huge one related to us is, I was an attendee there for the national convening, but also sat on one of the panels, and one of the panels was the outcomes for outcomes, empowerment for equitable outcomes in tribal communities. So sitting on that panel and being able to present a lot of our lived experiences, some of the data points that we have in terms of our relationship to tribal sovereignty, state and federal programming such as Title VI, being able to understand a lot of these things and acronyms. And so, being able to sit there and present on some solutions. And so I feel like right now, ball's in your court, basically, to the federal government. And you brought us to the table. We feel seen, we feel heard. Now, what are going to be those actionable, actionable steps to move forward? And so one of them that I would like to see is a lot of the funding related to tribal sovereignty is, in a way, federal funding that is funneled down to sovereign nations are a lot of times, for lack of a better word, become entangled, because there's not a flexible way to, have federal funding immediately, I guess, creating those, like, for example, the Indian Self-Governance Program, that authorizes tribes to develop agreements to operate a range of federal programs in a way that minimizes oversight by federal agencies and maximizes flexibility for tribal governments, to redesign these programs and reallocate those funds. And I feel like a lot of that, 638 contracting, for example. And so I'm talking to a lot of regards to funding because we do get a lot of funding, but a lot of that becomes tied up. And when it becomes tied up, it is sent back. And so, we're looking at statistics that say, okay, we've invested billions into tribal communities, but how much of that is actually sent back because we're not able to use it? And because of all of the bureaucracy that entangles that funding, a lot of the policy that entangles that funding. And so, as sovereign as we are, the ability to move freely, but also we're adverse because of the policies and laws and regulations that surround federal laws and how that umbrellas us as tribal communities. And so that's something that I feel like needs to be discussed and needs to be changed in a way that, slowly at least something in that direction to help us move forward without so much adversity, without so much red tape, barring not only ourselves as programs, but our children and our families in that sense from having that access to that type of funding.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you. Anthony, we'll transition right to you. There's so much that Zach just shared with us. And so I just kind of wanted to take a breather on some of that, but we'll transition right over to you, Anthony, on some of your, maybe one of your suggestions or hopes that the federal government will take moving forward after the national convening.
Well, at the convening, well, before that, when we had the planning sessions, I remember the second session, we were talking about different things, and I said my collaboration moved at the speed of trust, and immediately I forgot her name, the one who was in charge of our region, or the way what we're going to present. She just jumped on it, and she was like, "You know what? We can use that in the convening." And I was like, "Sure, go ahead." So then I went from like the planning sessions. Then she asked me would I like to be a part of the panel, and I said, "Sure, okay, that'll work." And then after that, she was like, "Well, how about you being the moderator?" And that's what it's all about, not just for me, but to show different people, parents, that it is possible. I think that's one of the greatest things that that is happening, that parents are getting involved and the government and the state are listening. And Michigan has one of the highest rates of parent inclusion, and I love that. But we can't just keep talking about the problem. We've been talking about the problem for years and years, and a lot of the committees that I'm on, I always tell them, and they listen, but they go right back to what's coming. Let's have a meeting. Let's have a study. And it's like it just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling. And as I mentioned by this whole panel, we have to have some action. We have to see what we're trying to suggest be implemented. And it's just like, it's time, like I said, when nothing bad is in the news cycle, do you still think Black Lives Matter? And I always ask different ones in the meetings, like, does Black Lives still matter today? And I mean, I'm just asking them off the cuff. And I just want to hear their answer, because it's like, yeah, well, blah, 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 blah. If Black Lives Matter, it has to matter every day. Point blank period. But yeah, at the convening, it was like progression. And again, I forgot the regional lady I was with, but she was like, when she asked me to be a moderator, I was really shocked that she asked me to do that. But I was really proud that she asked me to do that as well.
That was Antoinette.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you all. You have given us a lot. And so we are kind of winding down, and I do want to move on to one of these last questions. And Angela, I'm going to kind of throw maybe a two-part question in for you on our last question, because I want to hear a little bit more from you just around your suggestions that other leaders and government agencies can take. But transitioning to this last question, we want to hear from you all, parent leaders, about a time where you have truly felt valued as a parent leader when an organization or a government office has demonstrated time, trust, and power sharing. So again, we talked about buzzwords. We know that you all are experts and have been doing parent leadership work for some time. And so if you could just share a little bit about maybe a time, one time that you have felt truly valued in your parent leadership role. And we'll go ahead and start with Zach.
Yes. Wow. And so again, when we were expecting our child, cradle boards was our tool. That was it turned in technically into a safe sleep initiative with our state. And so through our state, right now, for example, right now as we speak, New Mexico Department of Health is working on creating materials and educational videos and pictures and materials to bring that awareness to why cradle boards are important in safe sleep, and father engagement, breastfeeding engagement, and father inclusion. And so those are things that, we're bringing to the table now as parent leaders. I also sit on the Early Childhood and Care Advisory Council under our governor's cabinet. And so with that, with being felt, with being seen, with being heard of, I feel like, being able to move in these directions where ultimately our children will not have to be at this point again, continuing to advocate on the same problems that we're advocating on today. And so I think that's something that has really resonated with me, between myself and our local government, to also, I would say a year and a half ago, I presented to our statewide home visiting program, where a lot of their home visiting managers, departments, and programs came to a conference, and it was the train to trainer method, where I presented on cradle boards. I presented as a father, and being able to say, we have statistics out there that say, we don't have a lot of fathers involved. What can we do to get them involved? And here's a toolkit that I went out and I had to go learn this traditionally, culturally, went out and educated myself on why cradle boards are important, and the significance and the makeup of what a cradle board means, but also being able to use that in modern Western medicine methods. So, for us, we would prefer using a cradle board than a bassinet. We would prefer to use a cradle board and have that ability to co-sleep with our children, understand and have that engagement, but also listening to them. What type of cries do they have? Are they hungry? Are they teething? Are they discomforted because of their indigestion? All of these, as a father, I was able to engage with my son immediately, be using that cradle board as that tool. I couldn't have heard all of those things if he was sleeping in the other room in the crib.
Mm.
And not only does that, when you do that, you are lowering the rates of SIDS, sudden infant deaths. So all these things came into play where we're able to use these primitive tools as indigenous communities and bring them to the table and make them contemporary, make them modern, and not only just bringing that awareness and education, but implementing them immediately. That
Wow.
has something impacted myself, my state, and our tribal community, and most importantly, our son. And so now I'm able to continue to teach that to other fathers in our area to this day. And of course, like I said, now New Mexico Department of Health is involved in creating this materials, this educational videos, and bringing that to other fathers who want to build a cradle board.
That is great, Zach, and that is a awesome example of how you've been able to kind of engage in parent leadership work in your own state. Thank you for sharing that, and interesting in hearing more and learning more about the benefit of cradle boards as well. Amber, we'll move along to you. And so as we're winding down, if you could maybe just share one time where you truly felt valued as a parent leader when working with organizations or government offices.
I would have to say, first and foremost, when it comes to the buzzword empowerment, that there's mixed reviews. Some people think it's a negative thing. That who is it for someone else to say that I don't have power? and then some people think it's a great, but I think that empowerment is power sharing, that you can't be empowered if there's not a power dynamic, and that it is an interconnected thing where those that are in so-called power are collaboratively sharing and shifting power. And you as an individual that may have in other cases felt powerless, you're coming into your realization that you have power no matter what, and those in power don't really have power unless you acknowledge their power. And so I think that it's important that we really understand empowerment and the dynamic of power so that we can be good stewards of power. And so I appreciated being asked to come be a part of the convening, but a great example of like power sharing that I was able to be a part of and really actually made me feel empowered as a parent leader is I was invited to be a part of a hiring panel with CSSP, which is the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and they're headquartered in Washington, D.C. And so the reason why I felt empowered during that process is because the individuals that were on the panel that were from the organization, they just effortlessly uplifted the parent leaders, as in we were asked to contribute to the actual interview questions. We were the communication was open and free, and even when I contributed to the questions, as we were narrowing down and making sure that we didn't have too many questions or whatever, some of the things that I uplifted in my questions, they kind of were going to get taken out because they felt like they were going to be touched in other areas. And so one of the organizational leaders that was a part of the panel, she kind of reflected on the question and then resubmitted it according to her experiences, understanding that if a parent leader brought it up, it must be important. So how does it actually work, in this? Because sometimes as parent leaders, when we come to the table, we don't understand the intersectionality of the organization or the work that's being done versus our experience. So leaders really should feel the need to really hear what the parent leader is saying, and then if it needs to be reworded or brought the relevance into it by their understanding.
And Angela, so we want to wind down and kind of finish with you, and I want to ask you kind of a two-part question as we wrap this up. And so, in what ways are parent leaders and parent voice evolving in the federal government? And then the second part is, what suggestions may you have for leaders in government agencies on how to center the work of parent leadership?
Well, first, I'd say Zach posed a question that needs to be answered, and one thing is respect. Those of us in government need to respect the voices and questions of those we're serving, and we're serving you. I'm paid by your taxpayer dollars. I'm serving you. So one thing Zach asked is, what are we doing in terms of hearing from our tribal nations in regards to the challenges around funding and accessing those funding and utilizing those funding. And I will say we have ANA, which is the Administration for Native Americans within ACF. And the deputy director, McDonald Longtree, was at the convening, but the director, Kanush, I know they had focus group meetings around this area to talk to actual tribal leaders and those who are impacted by our funding, and they are working on actually trying to change how they're distributing those funds, those NOFOs, those notice of opportunity funding. I'm gonna mess that acronym up. But notice of funding opportunities, those NOFOs for ANA, and also see how they can make it more equitable and simplified. So they are doing that right now, from what they have heard from our tribal leaders. The other thing that was mentioned was how do we make sure we are still hearing from our parents as we continue on. One thing that I'm going to do, I want to make sure that all our participants of our listening sessions receive a report out from the convening, so they'll see what the results were, and then also let them know what my next steps are. So they're going to be receiving that. I just got my report from my contractor recently, so I need to put that all together for them. But I think it's important to understand within the federal government, there are regulations, and some people say that's a lot of red tape of how we receive input from external partners. But I actually think it's a way to ensure that there's equitable way that we receive information. So there is a Federal Advisory Committee Act, a FACA, which gives us certain requirements we have to meet in order to even gain input from parents and any external partner. That's why I did a listening session that allows me to hear everything that they're, all their thoughts and ideas and recommendations, and then we're able to make decisions based on their input. But I think it's important for people to know there are a lot of guidelines around how we gain input. But this administration this is my third administration I've been in. This administration has uplifted those lived experience, and I had ever seen it done before. We're about to get a chief equity officer within ACF. They're going to have staff. Sometimes we post positions, but they have no one to help them do the work. They're about to get a team around that. They're going to get a stakeholder engagement officer. We have funding now to try to make sure we can bring in those lived experience to give input through listening sessions. So this is the one time I've seen the federal government truly not just put, words behind it, but put money behind what they're standing on. And what we've created, we have now a web page around equity, which puts out what every single program office is doing around equity. And we want you to hold us accountable. So on there, we say what we should be doing next. And you could actually, email us and say, hey, you said by 2023, you'll have these listening sessions. You'll integrate this into policy. Where are you on that? So we actually are very transparent. It's out there on the web at acf.hhs.gov/equity, and you'll see every program officer's equity plan and how they're going to meet those plans. So this administration has truly been engaged, not just in rhetoric, but in action, and requiring us to show outcomes. And it's exciting. It's exciting to see that come together and be a part of that.
Wow. Great. Thank you, Angela, and all of our panelists. And it is clear that is an exciting time to be engaged in the early childhood system work and in parent and family leadership work. And so this has been great. And before we let everyone go, including our participants, we do want to make a short, exciting announcement about the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership. On behalf of the Early Childhood Investment Corporation and the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership, we want to thank you all again for your attendance and tuning in. As stated, we will plan to follow up with the Q&A fact sheet for those who attended today's session. And we would like to give another special thanks to the Pritzker Children's Initiative for hosting. We know everyone who attended today values family and parent leadership. And like Miss Angela Green said, childhood is sacred. The early childhood system is stronger and more effective when parents are leading the work. And so we want to encourage us all to continue to explore ways that we can authentically and equitably work alongside parents and families, and truly embodying the term, nothing about us without us. So we want to thank you all and have a great day.